Welcome everybody, my name is Andrew DeCarlo and I'm really excited to have some time to share with you today a few techniques and ideas on how you can improve your documentation workflow through the use of Postman and some of the resources that they provide. Well, I'm sure that no one is really in the same position as we are as a company, and everyone's circumstances are unique. I think there should be enough here for you to be able to pull out some information that you could apply to your own documentation workflow or pipeline in your own environment. So a little backstory, when Postman announced its COVID-19 Resource Center back in March of 2020, my colleagues and I were really eager to get involved. I work for Metadata Technology in North America, and we're a small company whose members have been involved in statistical data and metadata management since the 1990s. And we believe strongly in the role that good, high quality data and metadata can play in addressing real life issues. We were just wrapping up the development of our Rich Data Services API. This is a REST service that has the goal of delivering high quality data and metadata to users through a single API. With the global pandemic facing our nation, we thought what better way to use our platform than to collect, refine, and publish high quality data for people to use to respond to the challenges that were ahead of us. So at that point, we set up a server to host our COVID-19 Rich Data Services data center. Now, this time we had been following the Johns Hopkins University dashboard for a month or two, and we began to poke around to see what their data was actually like. We found their GitHub repository, which has 3 global CSV files for confirmed cases, deaths, and recoveries that they use to power their dashboard. Now, this is what the files actually look like, and they're what we would call wide files, where you've got the province or the geographical locations, province, state, or country region, and then the latitude and longitude, and those are represented by the records. And then for every new date of information you have, you'll see the columns on the right-hand side just keep growing for every date. And with this, each file would have the measure of deaths, recoveries, or cases for that date. So this data is great, but we realized there was still a little work to be done before the data could really be used for analysis. So we went through the process of coding the data, which would be replacing these names for the geographical locations with standardized codes and their labels. We linked the files together and we restructured them a little bit so that what we end up with were 3 different files. We have country level, county level, and state level. The state's not shown because it's also included in the county level for the US. But what we did was, instead of having this wide file, we restructured it to be a long file so that each new date was represented by a new record in the file. And so in that way, it's a little more of a standard structure people can depend on and can easily use without having to adjust for that new day at the end of each file. Now, all the information about what we did to the data when we processed it is what we call metadata. It's documentation that's not only useful, but essential to the users when they are trying to determine if the data is going to be useful to them and if they can trust that data. So at this point, we have our catalog of data. We not only got the Johns Hopkins University data, but we also looked for other reputable sources of data. So we have Canadian country level data. We have data from different US states and also other national level data sets as well in our collection. And now we wanted to get it out there for people to use, because this data is also only useful for people if they have access to that. And so that's where this Postman COVID-19 Resource Center came in. We use Postman in our company to develop and test our APIs. And up until this year, most of my experience was just creating a hodgepodge of collections for myself to hit for reference pretty much when I'm working on an API or development. And when I need to see an example of something or reference some use case, I'll go back to my collection. But my colleague and company Postman expert, Carson Hunter, was a little further on in understanding how Postman can be used to create documentation. And when this COVID-19 Resource Center was announced, she began to work on a collection to highlight the different aspects of our API, specifically using our COVID-19 data center. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over real quick to that documentation. And this is what Carson came up with. So if I look at this, the introduction here itself is a great start because it provides everything that the users need to get started with. It gives information about who we are as a company, some resources that people can look into to help them get started with our API a little quicker, some open source SDKs that we've developed to work with our API, and then a little area here to reach out for help if you need it. So this is so much more than just a listing of endpoints. It's really helping people to get used to and familiar with our tool in general and give them all that they need to start using it as well. So going through what she's got here documented, the first part would be selecting the data. So if someone comes up to our API and wants to get data and start using it, how do they look through the data products that we have? What's available to them to make that decision on if we have the data that they need. So she's going to give a little bit of background of the different terms we have in our API, and then she's going to dive into some of the requests here that bring up the catalog and the data product metadata to help describe the different things that we have to make it easier for users to select the data and the variables that they want to work with. Now I'm going to jump down to this querying data section as well. This has some more specific use cases on actual queries that Carson came up with to demonstrate our API. She's going to describe here the variables and classifications that you can get. She also goes into this, into using the data into her project. So I'm going to come down here. She's got one for visualizing COVID-19 cases over time in the United States. So what she's got here is not only the call and the response that we have in Postman documentation, but she's also got some really good use case documentation here. And in our Postman collection, we've got the visualizations going that people can use. And so she's included a screenshot of that here to really show what we can do with the data here. So Carson submitted this collection to the Postman COVID-19 Resource Center, and much to our delight, the team loved what she put together. And so at this point, we're done, right? Well, not really. In addition to the ongoing efforts to continue adding data to our catalog for the COVID-19 project, the Postman team reached out to us and asked us if we could put together a similar collection around the 2020 US election. Carson had spent a lot of time putting this Postman collection together, and great as it was, maintaining this and writing a whole nother collection by hand would be a big task. As a small company, we needed her to be able to focus on some other projects as well. So we needed a way to speed up the process of creating these collections while maintaining a similar level of quality. And that's where I really started to get involved with the Postman side of things. So Carson threw this Postman collection JSON schema at me one day and posed the question, is there some way that we could just generate a collection based off what we already have documented in RDS? So it's true, we had tried to add all this descriptive metadata about the data products, about what was done to transform them, all that information there. So why should we have to write this twice? Why should we have to document it in our API and then rewrite it in our documentation? So we decided to give the collection generation process a try. And so I began to build a model off this JSON schema. So pretty much my goals would be to, step one, have a model that is going to accurately represent the Postman collection schema here. Two, I would need to fill out that model and be able to write it to JSON. And then three, I can import that JSON into Postman and have that published with all the examples and everything like that. And then fourth, I'm going to need to be able to update this in a way that's not going to break my links and things like that. So we're primarily a Java shop on the back end, and I figured that there had to be something out there to help me go from this schema to the Java POJOs that I would need to be filling out to generate this stuff. And after a little bit of searching, I found there's a JSON schema to POJO Maven plugin, which is very helpful. Now that got me about 90% of the way there. So based off of this schema, and I'm going to take a look at this, Postman's got some great descriptions here, which we'll see actually translate into good documentation in our Java objects. But pretty much we're going to need to create all these objects in Java. And with that Maven plugin, that's just what I was able to do. So here I've got a Postman model project. And we'll see that all those things that were described in the schema have been generated for us. And if I look at the collection here, that's what I have open. We've got the POJOs set up, and they're generated to be used with Jackson, which is a JSON library for Java. And so this pretty much just describes the order of the properties that they're going to be. We've got the objects here generated for us, along with Java docs and descriptions and property names that are all described in that Postman schema. So that is a great start for me to make this a lot quicker to get working with. There were just a few issues I had to handle myself going from JSON to Java. So if I go back to the schema here, oops, that's the wrong one. If I go back to my schema here, I'm going to come down to the URL object, and this is going to tell me that the URL can be one of two things. It can be just a simple string, or it can be a structured object with all these properties here. Now, for JavaScript, that's fine, but for Java, we need to have a little more structure than that. And so what I had to do was create an interface that I was going to implement. So I just created an empty interface for the URL object here. And I have two implementations. I have the URL implementation, which is going to have all those properties we just looked at. So this is going to be that structured object. And then we have the URL string implementation, and they implement the URL interface. And then for Jackson, again, pretty much what we need to do is be able to read and write these appropriately. So in that Jackson, you can write custom deserializers and serializers. And pretty much these just work against the interface. We check if what we are reading is the string. If so, we're going to use that object. Otherwise, we're going to map the JSON to the URL implementation. Same thing for when I write it out. I'm going to check and see if the URL that's being used is an instance of the string and write it as such, or if it's an object, I'll write that. Now, I'm getting into the weeds a little bit for Java development. And so if you're not a Java developer, I'm sorry. But all this to say that really the little issues that we had with the schema were easily overcome just with some basic programming knowledge around what we're using. So having that nicely documented schema from Postman and the Maven plugin really, really helped us to get off the ground very quickly. So step one is done. I have my model. I've got something that's going to comply to the schema. And if I serialize this as JSON, it should be written into or be able to be read into the Postman application. So I'm going to jump over to our platform now and take a look at what we have to work with when we're generating the schema. So if I go to our Rich Data Services Explorer, this is the catalog that we have there. And I'm going to take a look at the Johns Hopkins University county level reports. And first of all, we've got just a lot of data product or data set level documentation here. And this is what I was talking about before. This is information about what the data set is, where it comes from, how it's been transformed, all the things that we've done to it in that whole transformation process. And so we've got this descriptive high-level data product information to work with. I'm going to jump into this here and take a look at it. We also have the data. So this is the record level data of the data set. And so we've got about 805,000 records in there. So I have the data and I can get that through the API. I should say that this UI is built entirely off of our API, of the API. So everything that you see here is available through the API. So I've got the record level data. I've got variable metadata. So information about what each of these variables is, where it comes from, and if it has codes, the codes that are used in that column. So I've got descriptive data set level metadata. I've got record level data. I've got variable level metadata that's detailed. And then I can also take a look at this data dictionary view, which is going to give us kind of summary of the variable metadata. So that's what I started out with as my goal for my generated collections. I wanted to provide users with those 4 things. And so I'm going to jump back to Eclipse here real quick. I've got I came up with a Postman generator for our application that's able to be run through the API and to generate this JSON dynamically. And so here we are going through the process. I'm not going to dive into the code because it wouldn't make much sense to people. But pretty much this project's goal is to take the metadata and the data that we have in our API, use that to write the collection, and that is what's going to be produced. So how do we do that? Well, we get our objects from our API, and then we just are going to pass them into these templates that we have. We have these velocity templates where you can just pass in the object, and it's going to print out different sections. So this is a description of a request that's going to be used. Or if I've got another template for the entire collection that's being generated, this is going to take a look at the variables that we have in there and print different things out based on what's available. Another thing which we'll see, and this is all going to make a little more sense once we look at this in Postman, but another template that we have is our actual visualization code that we are going to use in Postman. So the collection that we generate is going to have a visualizer with each request. And that code is all going to be based on these templates and have kind of this dynamic aspect to it where it's going to be custom for the specific little section that it's part of. So we've got our generator, which is going to produce this file. So I'm going to exit out of this and go to my Finder here real quick. So like I said, that generator is a part of our API, the management part of the API. And I'm not going to run that on curl because I have my credentials in there. But this right here is the collection that we've generated for our COVID-19 Resource Center. And I think it's just a subset. So I'm going to go ahead and import this into Postman. And we're going to take a look at what we get here. All right, so I've got it imported. I've got 24 requests, and this was just for the United States catalog. So it's not going to have all those catalogs that we had in RDS. It's just going to have that United States catalog that we are looking at. And here's the the folder I have for those county level reports that we were just looking at. And if I take a look at each one of these requests, we're going to see that in my tests, we've got the template, that visualizer code that we were just talking about. And this is all based off of that template that I had there. So it should work for every single data set that we have. These all have the same 4 generic requests that we've got going, and they're all going to have stuff that's custom to them based on the variables that were put into them. So if I get my data set here and I take a look at the visualizer, it's going to have a nice little, human-friendly representation of the data that's coming back to it. And so if we are able to generate this rather than having to write this visualizer every single time, it's going to save us a lot of time and still give us kind of a nice polished look to what we're trying to present to our users or stakeholders. So I've got this for all these different requests here. We've got the data dictionary view that we were talking about, that kind of high-level metadata thing that we had in our UI. We've got some variable details here, which is just to look at the single variable. And then finally, we've got the record level data that's coming back. So I've been able to hit these 4 goals that I had with those 4 requests. Let's take a look at what it looks like when we publish this. So if I just preview the documentation of what we have here, we're going to see that we have that similar overview section, introduction about who we are, the visualizations that are involved with the requests along with the collection structure, the different resources that are available to users, the open source SDKs and support. So this is all coming from those templates. None of it's handwritten. And so we've been able to give our users a lot of information about what they're looking at here. So again, for each one of these folders, I'm going to go back down to the Johns Hopkins County level one. All that metadata is actually included in our documentation as well. So we're giving our users more robust documentation that can help them use the information that they're looking at. So I've accomplished step 2. I've been able to take the information we have in our system, put it in the model, serialize it out, and import that into Postman. Now, if we take a look at this here, there's one big glaring issue with our documentation, and that is that we don't have any example responses coming back. So that would be a great way to take this to the next level, is just to have these example responses of the JSON that's coming back for our users to see. I'm going to exit out of that and that. And I'm going to get rid of this guy here real quick. So I remembered, obviously I want to make this as easy as possible on myself to kind of automate this whole process. And I remembered that Carson had talked to me about this Newman command line utility that Postman has about a year ago when we were starting to use or look for a way to test our API. So we had used that in the past to come up with some test suites and run those against our API. And I was thinking that might be a good fit for this too, because it seems like something I could script and just kind of run very easily to get this job done. And so I wanted something that I could generate the example responses and add this to the collection that I have. And I looked around and I couldn't find anything that did that, but I was able to find that Newman has this Node.js module that you can use, and you can run through a collection in that. So I wrote my own little Node.js module that uses the Newman JavaScript to run through my collection, produce these example responses, and then add them to the collection. So I'm going to go ahead and run that right now. And if I go ahead and run that, it's going to use that collection that we were just looking at. It's going to run through all the requests that we have in there. And then once it gets those responses back, it's going to add the responses to the specific requests. All right, so it's done. It took a few seconds for 24 requests, I think it was, and that's going to output this this one that has the examples on that. So I'm going to go ahead back into Postman and import those and see what we have. All right, so now we have our 24 requests. That looks good, the same as before. And if I go into each of these, I can see now that I've got a saved response example. And even more importantly, if I go back and preview my docs again, now when I come down to the different requests, we're going to have these example responses coming back. And so this is much more useful to my end users to be able to see what they're working with each one of these things, have that kind of go along with the description of what I'm telling them is going to be happening with this. And it also gives them a good place to start just in the documentation without having to go into the Postman application. So step 3 is complete. I've got my model. I've filled it out with information from our system, and now I've generated this out of our system that has these example responses for people to view. So now, for the most part, we're done. We've got our nice generated collection here. And the last thing that we need to do is to update our collection when something changes. So that would be like if I added more data to the catalog and I wanted to add a new data product to the documentation as well. The workflow would be pretty much the same as what we did just now. We would start out with just generating the collection. We would run it through the Newman example generator, and then we would need to push that to our published documentation, and we can do that through the use of the Postman API. Postman has the this update collection method here, and you pretty much just pass in the collection as you're updating to the Postman API with your API key, and that's going to update the collection that's published. So with using that as kind of the final step in the process, we're able to update and push our documentation for our users to see without, ever worrying about if we're doing it right or breaking links or things like that. The Postman API lets us get to that final step of the process. The workflow we had was to update our catalog, generate the Postman collection, generate the example responses, and then publish and update the collection through the API. So that's pretty much a summary of what we've been working on and how it works. All the resources that I've talked about today are available right here. We've got a couple things to be aware of. The Postman collection JSON schema is available here. We have the Postman collection Java model that we generated available, open source on GitHub, along with the Newman example generator, the Node.js little module that I was just using there. And so these are all available for you to take a look at and contribute to, and we would love to have you guys start using them for your own projects and things like that. Our next steps as we continue playing around with collection generation would be to use the information in our system a little more intelligently to create more comprehensive and unique requests for each data product. So right now, my goal was to meet those four different requests that give the metadata for the data products, the variables, and then the actual data. But what if we could use our metadata to determine a subset of data or an aggregate of data that's more interesting based on the data product that we're looking at and return that as a request? Or what if we could use some information about the request to determine what chart to use in a visualization or something like that? So we will be continuing to explore those options and the opportunities that the Postman collection provide for us in our documentation. I hope you can take something away from this and apply it to your own environment. And thanks a lot for letting me share with you our story. If you have any questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. Thanks.